Great. So yeah, welcome everybody to the GIST seminar. It's a pleasure to welcome two speakers today. So first we've got Mark, who's a reader in data and society in the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, and a socio-technical researcher focusing on big data, mobile apps, algorithms, and machine learning. He has been PI or co-I on EPSRC, Horizon 2020, and AHRC grants, valued more than £10 million, including So Big Data++, the European Research Infrastructure of Social Data Analytics, Refrain, which funded a lot of projects here in Glasgow, and Safe AI Assistance. His work has been published widely across leading journals ranging from Big Data and Society, CHI, CUI, and IEEE Computers. It's a pleasure to have you, Mark. We've also got Jennifer Pybus from all the way from Canada. So she is a Canada Research Chair in AI, Data, and Society at York University. So York University is in Canada, not in York. That was something I learned for the first time. Her interdisciplinary research intersects digital and algorithmic cultures and explores the capture and processing of personal data across social media platforms in relation to algorithmic profiling, monetization, polarization, and bias. She addressed and lived experiences of that application by cultivating innovative tools, resources, and pedagogy for increasing critical data literacy and agency, and through democratic debate about artificial intelligence. So it's a pleasure to have you both here today. Thank you so much for making it all the way here, and we're looking forward to your talk. The topics are very interesting and very relevant to a lot of people here, a lot of people working in privacy and ethical AI, and yeah, we're looking forward to your talks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start and then Jennifer will follow. So we're going to talk about SDKs, in particular, this idea of super SDKs, and looking at the way our personal data is tracked, and looking also at how they facilitate the rise of platform monopolies generally across the mobile ecosystem. So there we go. Okay. We're going to talk, this is just about to be published. We're just completing our final revisions, and it's been accepted into publication. And this is really drawing on research that we've been doing for quite a few years. Jennifer was at King's College London before she got her research chair. And they're like going back to 2015, 2013, actually, when I first started at King's. We did a project right around the time of the kind of the Snowden revelation, and we worked with teen coders, and we wanted to look at that time rather naively and ask the question about what kind of data are you generating on your mobile phone, and then also asking what would it mean to be able to access that data and utilize it in the idea of a social data commons, right, as opposed to the transactional relationships that we have with data, wherein we give our personal data in exchange for services, and then in turn it's monetized. We've done follow-up projects with the Open Data Institute. Jennifer then led another project developing a whole host of tools to especially focused at non-computer scientists to be able to go into your mobile phone, to be able to open up apps. And initially we were looking at data permissions. And as we delved in deeper, well, we'll talk about it more, but we then kept coming across this SDK, and not being computer scientists, we're thinking this is very strictly of interest to developers. And as we looked in more, we kind of realized it was a little bit more complex. So let's just start really quickly. I added these slides. Jennifer's like, we have too many slides. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go really fast as a high level overview. Okay, so 7 things, but we'll go really quickly. So first, SDKs are trackers, right? And this was a kind of the starting point. We were talking about trackers, and that term is still widely used. Well, SDKs are trackers, right? They're really core technical objects for platform and surveillance capitalism. They enable advertising surveillance, analytics, behavioral, and location tracking. Okay, so that's point number 1. Point number 2, we talk a lot about APIs, but SDKs are much more than APIs. They contain APIs, of course, but also code, libraries, tutorials from platforms and or third parties. So then kind of realize, yeah, SDKs are interesting because now we can be much more specific about trackers. We can actually start to think about third parties and the way third parties are embedded into apps. SDKs commodify data, right? This is the key to that exchange of data for services, which is fundamental to monetization, which is required for targeted advertising, for conversion, for optimization, for service personalization. For all of these things, SDKs play a central role. SDKs are advanced surveillance tools, right? Cross-device and platform tracking for comprehensive user analytics. They provide capacity to build AI models for facial recognition, natural language processing, the embedding of that into applications, which is increasingly becoming kind of a standard expectation, and for predictive machine learning tools. SDKs have hidden privacy costs. Right? They're free to developers. They generally provide free service to users. Our colleague from Refrain, Awais Rashid, I mean, his lab has done research on this, on the way that kind of the use of SDKs unfairly kind of downloads responsibility for security and privacy onto developers, even though those SDKs tend to be relatively black boxed and are not necessarily well understood. Third-party code is embedded in app, and this provides high quality personal data collection, both at scale and outside of user knowledge control, and importantly, regulatory oversight. Which brings us to the sixth point, which is SDKs evade privacy regulation. Laws really poorly understand these technical objects. Regulations are aimed more at developers than the SDKs that are central to their workflow. They're in a gray zone because they're able to inherit the full range of permissions that the developer has asked for. And they're really understudied within the legal literature. We had a meeting not so long ago in London with Julie Coné at Georgetown, I think. And that was her, I mean, does a leading legal figure in kind of privacy law, and her big takeaway is we don't understand what SDKs are. They're really not even accounted for legally. And they can't easily be made privacy compliant for developers, right? Because it's a technical practice of installing plug and play tools and services. Well, so developers don't need to write the code. That black box effect can unhinge behavior from a security rationale. They are highly unequal socio-technical relations of power with platform power, as we're going to see with this idea of the super SDK. And the literature shows a much higher prevalence of privacy violations in relation to SDKs. Okay. Now, let's think about the context, at least for this talk, in thinking, in focusing on SDK, and that's just broadly around datafication. So 7 things about datafication. We're not going to talk so much about platform monopolization, but this can at least touch on that. You can read about that more in our article. I think many of these things will be straightforward and understandable for everybody here. Data is generative, right? Datafication is the kind of the socio-technical process that truly defines our historical moment, right? Our lives and our life world, our lived environment, all of that is captured, much of that is captured as discrete data points. It's transformed continuously into actionable insight and value, and it's polyvalent in the sense that it's capable of generating myriad kinds of value, economic, social, and it's also opportunistic, right? It's distributed, right? It's generated by people, it's generated by sensors, by the life world, and this kind of generative productivity, it's diffused across time and space. And so when we're also then thinking right now, I mean, with generative AI and the way that's moving very quickly and breaking things along the way and transforming things, I mean, this is just the most obvious and clear and crystallized manifestation of that kind of generative productivity of data when it operates at scale. and there's exhaustivity, and this is kind of this opportunistic capture, right? Like so much of data is not necessarily planned, it's there and it has this inherent value. And this is going, that explains in a sense the kind of the shift or the imagined shift from the representative sample to n equals all. This is one of the reasons why Google was able to get such a competitive advantage, because early on there was an understanding and a recognition that there was an inherent value with data at scale, which leads into economies of scale, right? So the fixed and variable costs of data capture and analysis decrease at scale. This is very straightforward. And computational techniques, especially in machine learning, require scale to learn. And we're seeing performance increases with size. I mean, not in a simple or in all cases with, say, large language models, but generally speaking, there are certainly in economic terms, this plays out, but it's also playing out in being reinforced technically. And economies of scope, right? So aggregation of data sets increases the scope for relational insight, right? So this is about variety as opposed to scale. And this is potentially, theoretically, to some degree, about how this allows for a wider capture of social complexity, right? In a positive way, there are data analysts that want that economies of scope to be able to capture diversity, to have more kinds of inclusive analysis. But equally, this is a way of expanding different dimensions of surveillance as well, right? Non-rivalry is really important and not remarked upon enough. This is very straightforward. I mean, the same data can be used by many at the same time, right? And in many instances, the more people that are using the same data, the more benefit that can be derived, right? This is the kind of the public good argument for open data, right? The possibility that it can be utilized differently. And if you're thinking in terms of more community-led kind of projects or opportunities, then this is precisely because a community will have a lived experience of data that can lead to very, very different kinds of applications and uses than if this is centralized by a platform which tends to seek exclusivity, right? Google, Facebook, etc. They seek technical and they seek regulatory exclusivity, right? They seek to impose kind of non-rivalry on data used by apps, by third parties and them, but they want, they take advantage of the non-rivalrous of data by, especially through third party, being a third party SDK in an app as an example, but they seek the benefits of exclusive rights for the data that's in their protection, right? And we already know that the more protection, more revenues bring danger of exclusive monopolistic control, okay? So 7 things, right? These are just high-level things to think about when we talk a little bit more about what we're doing. So there we have the gold smartphone, right? Smartphones are the foundation of the data economy. Just everybody here can just quickly do a fast thought experiment. Think of how much time and how much data do you generate in a given day on your smartphone in relation to all other digital devices that you have. Probably for the majority of us, it's the majority of the data, right? Here's just we can see this is desktop, the mobile internet ad revenues from 2012 to 2022. It's going in one direction. As recently as 11 years ago, less than 10% of revenues came from mobiles. Here's where it changed. By 2016, it was just slightly ahead, and now it's about 75% of revenues for digital advertising comes from the mobile. So there's been a massive and a fundamental switch. If we had time to talk about it, we could talk about the challenges and limitations of web browsers and cookies and the ease with which they could be disabled and so on, but we don't, and I think you all know that in any case. So let's just kind of reinforce this, and we can see that 94% of Facebook's ad revenue came from mobile advertising, which is quite remarkable. It's 2021. Google, not quite as much, but just a shade under 70%, so still quite significant. So this is just, Jennifer looked at, which app was this one? It was a menstruation cycle app? Clue, right. And so kind of just in opening up apps, kind of, and the more we put it under the microscope, the more complex we realized it was in terms of data capture. This is using the Exodus privacy tool. And while Jennifer's going to talk about the pie chart in a moment, so I'll just leave that. But the idea being, the closer that we look, the more that we realized that thinking at the level of the application, thinking in terms of even data permissions, didn't really give us a remotely adequate understanding of what kind of data was being captured by whom for what purpose, right? So as we delved more deeply, we kind of were also thinking about how do we frame this, and being in humanities, of course, we need some concepts to think about this. So maybe not many of you know Gabriel Tarde, the sociologist. Does anybody know Tarde? Okay, so just really quickly, a major debate, I'm not a sociologist at all, but within sociology, a major debate, Durkheim, who won, and Tarde, who lost. Durkheim said, focus on the big, so look at the level of the big, that is at the level of society, and you kind of just assume the social fact of society. Whereas Tarde said, yeah, but what we actually need to look at are these things he called monads, which were essentially thinking about what are all the things that cohere in order to create an actual functioning society, right? As opposed to assuming that the society is the social fact. What are the elements that make up that social fact? So it kind of flips around the perspective of sociology from looking at that overarching level, and instead not assuming that social fact, but asking how they cohere, which is the monad. The monad, I mean, if we had time, we could go. Leibniz was also really important in conceptualizing monads as he was developing, what became calculus. Bruno Latour, which maybe does kind of actor network theory. He looks at the way in which networks cohere, and equally, rather than looking at the network level, is thinking about what coheres networks at their point of meeting. So, and he has this idea of looking at the network of interactions, and this quote from his piece, "The whole is always smaller than its parts, the digital test of Gabriel Tarde's monads," where he looked at network relations across kind of in an internet kind of setting. The smallest entities are always richer in difference and complexity than their aggregates. The small is always the most complex. We've always invariably looked at data as opposed to platforms, as opposed to kind of infrastructure. So this has worked well for us. And so we kind of raised this idea in this recent article of this concept of a data monadology. Some of you might know this within computer scientists from, I think it's functional programming. Uses monads, but we weren't really inspired by that.
No, that's smart.
Yeah. So this is just about thinking about how can we think about those socio-technical kind of interconnectivity that specifically kind of facilitates, in this instance, the kind of the collection of different kinds of data attributes, right? And how that coheres datafied networks of our lives because of this kind of non-rivalrous quality of the data, right? So this is going back to that kind of polyvalent and opportunistic qualities, wherein it can always be used by multiple actors simultaneously, which can kind of maximize potential value. And so, like, if we think about knowing and connecting for the monad, it doesn't come from knowing the whole, right? But like, as in knowing you. And this is, I think, also really important if we want to think about kind of data surveillance or surveillance capitalism. Now, this is not to say that there are not people and there are not segments of the population that are surveilled quite specifically in relation to others, because that's a highly differential process. But if we think about much of the market-driven surveillance, then it's really less about knowing things personally about you so you can be snooped upon. It's really more about understanding your attributes, your preferences, your opinions, that can then be used essentially to optimize, to personalize, to target you, right? And hence be reused and repositioned depending on what kind of truth or profile is required. In the process, creating these different kinds of, not social facts as it was for TARD, but kind of facts within this realm of kind of datafication. And all of this, we're saying, is not exclusively understandable by the SDK, but that the SDK is an interesting and a kind of a privileged technical object that allows us to look at that, right? And so this can kind of help us to see how platforms and other third parties inherently kind of understand that we are our attributes are us. And there we can just quickly see something that's from digital marketing that Jennifer. Now, I'm just about out of time, but I know Mohammed is, oh, wrong slides, Jen. Okay, never mind. I added a slide. This keyhole I used DALL-E to generate, but I presented part of these slides in Italy originally, and anyone who's been to Rome and maybe knows the Aventino, and there's a small little keyhole. I don't know if has anyone ever looked through that, and if you would just see a big door, and it's like a 15th century door, and there's a keyhole, but the keyhole was designed to give a perfect and expansive view of Rome with the Dome of St. Peter's right in the middle. And so we started to, I presented this, I did have that slide for you. In any case, we then thought, okay, well, because the SDK is kind of like a keyhole, right? It is the small object, and that the small of the SDK actually allows for a very expansive view of the app ecosystem of platforms, of power, of personal data, of privacy, of regulation, of knowledge production, right? And so this is kind of our reworking of what Latour said, that we say that the small of the SDK gives us an expansive view of the large of platform and data capitalism. And I think I will pass it over to Jennifer.
I didn't delete that.
Okay, I didn't go over.
Okay, so with that in mind, this sort of takes us into the research part of the paper that we're about to publish. And we just wanted to understand, how can we look at SDKs? You know, can we kind of create some sort of taxonomy to start understanding what are the service offerings? What should we be focusing on? What's not focused on? Let's just have a look. So this sort of takes us into this. And, you know, I don't know, I never know, because I do this talk, because in a politics department and talking mainly to non-computer scientists, I always assume that nobody has any idea really what an SDK is. So I don't know if I can't really make that same assumption for all of you. But as Mark had said, we have all of these different tools that are inside there. And one of the kind of key questions that we always get in talks, and I've had it in like paper reviews and conference reviews, is what's the difference between SDK and API?
Don't you mean it's an API?
Don't you mean it's an API? I'm like, yes, there are APIs inside of SDKs. It's obviously, these are modular connectors. They're important to bring services from one place into an application and make them work. So by nature and definition, they must have an API, but they do many different jobs for applications, as opposed to SDK, which has one job, which is to connect. So I think that
other way around.
no, sorry, API has one job and SDK has many jobs. Yes, thank you. Sorry, like all over here. But yes, so I think it's just really important to kind of think about that. Yes, they're connecting, but they're doing all of these different things. And, you know, if we kind of think about the history of SDKs, which is always kind of good because actually it's not a very long history. We started back in 2007 when the the iPhone was first introduced by Steve Jobs. We knew that, you know, he had, for those of you who remember, he kind of imagined, okay, we can have like web apps and then they can use our SDK to kind of connect those web apps, but they won't actually be on the phone. They'll be like in Safari. And all the developers are like, this is a terrible idea. We don't like this at all. Some of them kind of jailbroke the original SDK so they could just hack their way onto the interface. And Apple was like, okay, maybe we should kind of take a page and see what's going on. So they reconfigured all of these things. And so really the first software development kit was created by Apple and was given to developers to say, yes, you can use this so that you can connect onto our interface and have your app actually in on the Apple phone. So it's like one of the kind of histories of this strange thing. And its purpose at that point was to just basically make the phone and the apps more interoperable so they could exist in the space. And the App Store came out of this arrangement. So in that sense, actually, yeah, so when we kind of think in terms of like key functionalities of these SDKs, you know, these are core technical objects for platform, and Marcus talked extensively about surveillance capitalism. They make data essentially, as we'll see in a moment, kind of more platform ready because these are the main players within this ecosystem. They make it easy to kind of integrate for their own kind of needs and analytics, profiling and whatnot. They are more than APIs, very important. And they often, as Mark said, evade privacy regulations because of their embeddedness inside of applications. So this takes us then to the SDK taxonomy that we developed. So like knowing all of this, what do they actually look like and what do they do and how do we study them? And this is especially from somebody who is not in computer science. So I'm a kind of, you know, in the basement librarian slogging person who's very like close to political economy, digging through lots of websites. It's not pretty work, but anyways, we come to this thing. So I'm going to go through this in a moment, but just as a kind of bird's eye view, we kind of divided the SDK into kind of three main offerings of services. One, which we're kind of all very close, near and dear, the programmatic ad tech, which I think gets the most attention. And Mark said SDKs are trackers. I think in the sense of tracker, this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about programmatic ad tech. So we have different kinds of services that are offered there. Next, we have app development, and this is actually the kind of construction of the application. And I don't think people would technically or necessarily equate SDKs and trackers when it comes to this, because ultimately it's like developers need these resources to put apps together, whether it's environments, whether it's cloud access and support, or whether it's different kinds of increasingly AI machine learning capabilities that, you know, Firebase and Apple are now offering to developers. These are kind of external tools that go inside libraries and whatnot, that the user would not necessarily see at all because it was seamlessly integrated or used to create that application in the first place. And then this last category is kind of, I think that one feels like the most work in progress, but we call them app extensions for lack of a better way of thinking about it. These are SDKs that are integrated that the end user would actually see, whether it's social login, whether they're payment services, whether it's maps, and whatnot. So these are the SDKs that as a user, you go into the app, you're quite clear. This did not, you know, the developer clearly didn't make this. This came from someone else, and I'm using it to access some kind of service inside this app that I'm in. So those are the three different, and then the last one, which we kind of have there on its own, the Super SDK, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And we kind of came up with this category because we realized actually some SDKs are really specific, you know, like this one, Urban Airship, where this is a very clear kind of, you know, programmatic ad tech SDK that does a lot of work, especially around engagement and attribution. And that's pretty much it. Whereas other SDKs, like Firebase and Facebook, seem to appear in all of these different categories. They seem to kind of maximize their offering for developers. So we're like, that's kind of interesting. Does this apply to other SDKs? You know, we had a really small sample. We looked initially at 15 different SDKs, and it seems that only the platforms were offering this, although I think, you know, definitely more research needs to be done. So our taxonomy, for us, we argue that it provides a kind of comprehensive framework for data access and use and analysis. So it's an explanatory model that can be used to kind of open up this very opaque, small piece of obscure infrastructure that most people outside of developers know very little about. And we want to kind of think about this, especially in relationship to privacy regulations, because there is on average of 18 different SDKs in every mobile application. Many of these come from different countries. There are all kinds of like data sovereignty concerns. Where is the data going? Where is it flowing? Supposedly in the EU and the UK is sort of a bit floaty right now, but you know, there's if it leaves the UK and goes to a different country, then it's supposed to be an approved server. Nobody really knows what approved means. I don't think I was looking, the EU doesn't really have clear definitions. There's no kind of map or anything that we know this is approved or not. So there's all kinds of different issues in terms of data flows and movements. And also just kind of when people do traditional network analysis around mobile applications, we don't really actually see the granularity of, okay, location came, but who took it? Is it like location that came once that went to the app, or is it location that actually went 6 times that went to, you know, the same APK, but SDK, but like, you know, through different services that they're offering? It's a huge giant question mark. So we know that clearly data is going to programmatic advertising. We have no idea, is it going to these development services? So we're trying to kind of ask this question of, you know, here are the services. How can we start to kind of deepen and kind of think about, that would be the next step in my dream when I'm like another degree as a computer scientist, do the network analysis, but luckily there are lots of you who can. So that's like the kind of, how can you map this sort of more static analysis onto a more network analysis? So we looked at, to put this together, we looked at the top SDKs. I consulted a whole bunch of different lists that most apps were using. And then we did a deep dive, nice research associates of mine, where we just kind of combed through websites, tried to map out every service that they had, and then kind of brought that back to the websites. Do these actually work? And it was very iterative, a lot of different versions. And then tried to kind of work through the different categories. So that's how we kind of work through that. So this is just one example. In terms of programmatic ad tech, we broke this down into 3 categories. So one is engagement. So engagement services, they're all linked to profile building, right? So these are services for generating psychographics, user groupings by interest, habits. So all those attributes that Mark was talking about in terms of the data methodology, these are instrumental services that are offered in order to kind of work out, okay, Jen she checked out a yoga site. Okay, she's got kids. She's like an academic and she likes this. So if we combine this, then okay, we'll send her this like outfit. She'll love it. Perfect. So these are kind of just trying to work out who you are types of for personal data optimized advertising. And they use a lot of different A/B testing analytics. So they'll show you like, you know, different, you know, iterations of things to work out what is the best way. So it offers all kinds of services like this so that the developers can take advantage. The other thing that is really important for this kind of thing is these kind of app events, which I'm sure many of you know all about. They're incredibly granulated, and it feels like you're in some kind of like video game where you're just kind of stepping and they're everywhere. Just whatever you do, purchase, refund, search, share, sign up, there's some little number that's going and tallying this. So it's very important to kind of work out how are you actually engaging with the content that's being offered to you. Then there's attribution. So these types of services, you know, basically we need to know which ad was seen by whom, what campaign did it come from, and what device did you actually see it on? right? So all of these types of things, ultimately in my mind, to attribute is to track, right? Because if you have this campaign and they're showing you something, then you need to be able to follow it and work out, should I can you need to kind of demonstrate to the advertiser that they're getting their return on investment. It's like, yes, they saw your campaign, they saw it here, then they went to your website and then they bought something. Awesome, tick. Now we're paying more money, right? So attribution is all about kind of mapping that visual ad to campaign. And it goes across channel. And this is why these ads follow you across everywhere, because there's these specialized services that need to work out where you saw things. Like Firebase, attribution, analytics. And then lastly, we have advertising. So that's the most straightforward. Everyone knows what that is. This is where, giving access to developers to advertising for monetization. And there's all kinds, even though it's kind of very simple and straightforward, an ad is served and you see it, the kind of infrastructure behind getting this ad to you is quite complex. And I won't go into it because I will bore you to death, but there's all kinds of different kind of players and actors who are kind of rolled into this kind of bidding war of eyes and rewards to ensure that you will see those particular ads. Okay, and this, yes, so app development, this is, I think this is kind of, this is for us a bit of a question mark in terms of SDKs. It seems pretty obvious that personal data would be kind of accessed and used. And, if you read the privacy agreements of all of the companies that are providing those, they say quite clearly that they are accessing user data. Some of them say they access user data and they share it with their third parties. So we kind of mused in our paper, what do you call the third party of the third party? Is that I don't know, fourth party to something? And again, for us, this seems like a kind of data.
Obviously a ninth party.
It's a ninth party.
I'm afraid we'll get you a paper published just by itself first.
And I mean, for us, this also a kind of data protection question mark, because people are supposed to kind of know what data, but if data is kind of going from one place to another, is how many down the chain is it moving? And in the end, is it about kind of the individual at this point, or is it just the fact that, we're accepting that we're being tracked and now it's okay because it's going to all these places? App creation, on the other hand, this is, I think, very unknown. So I can't really conclusively say anything, but for us, we kind of, this is obviously where we're getting different services. We're building apps in iOS and Android. So all of these different frameworks that allow for that kind of seamless integration, specialized services from font animation. So we're in React and you have all kinds of different open access, all of these different services that are in the kind of database there that you can use. All of this kind of falls into app creation, cloud-based and cloud access and data support. This is increasingly becoming important. Again, this is a big kind of flag for me anyways as privacy researcher, because this is increasingly the cloud and its infrastructure and where it's located, all the big fights that are happening right now around TikTok in the US. They have what is it, the Texas solution? We'll just ring fence TikTok in Texas in Oracle's farm, and then it'll be safe. Fine. But so this, ultimately all of these different companies, they have, Firebase, Google, they have their cloud servers all over the world for cloud hosting, and everyone is reliant on them now. Amazon as well, and Microsoft is throwing their hat in the ring. And then we were kind of surprised when we looked at all of the AI and machine learning offers that Firebase in particular, when we did a deep dive into their service, we're offering, whether it's giving people access to facial recognition technologies, giving them access to their algorithms for facial recognition, but you can upload all of your data into Google and they'll help you kind of organize that. And of course, then they get all of that data at the same time. AI for kind of sound, AI for you name it, it's all kind of there. So I guess this definitely, Mark will talk at the end about this, but this is clearly kind of a future offering. And for a developer that doesn't know how to do this or doesn't have the wherewithal, this is clearly kind of the easy modular plug and play. Don't worry, we can give you that facial recognition, no problem.
Yeah, and we're very interested in this, especially given OpenAI's recent announcement around customizable GPTs. Right? the shift from the killer app to the killer GPT, kind of thinking about that and that.
And then lastly, like app extensions. So I don't have like slides for these ones, but as I said, these are kind of like login authentication. So that's kind of the most common SDKs that we see. Social media plugins, but I think this is more legacy. Like they're not really. I think these are kind of being phased out more in favor of like other services that are integrated. And then we saw a lot of different payment services that were there, but I think as I said, this is maybe like the most incomplete. There's a whole bunch of probably other services that, you know, users would see and engage with, but that's kind of the gist of those extensions. And then this is a kind of to come back to the platform and why this kind of data monadology. So we kind of look at, you know, who are these actors that are offering these services? So this is a visualization from the first project that I led, where we had 4,000 apps in a database, and then we tried to visualize who were the third parties that were actually in there. And this is what it looked like. And if you can just see Facebook and Google, that's the point. This is confirmed, I think, by Ruben Binns and his team as well. We looked at 4,000. I thought that was a lot. They had 1 million. And their percentages were more or less in line with ours, where they had Google as trackers at like over 90% and Facebook sitting around like 60%. At the time when we did this, you would see like there's kind of Google Firebase Analytics, Google Crashlytics, Google Ads. So these were all separate SDKs that kind of increasingly combined into one or two SDKs, similar for Facebook. So they're not separate; they're kind of all together in one package. Okay, and so this takes us to, as I said, the rise of the super SDK. So a few years ago, we began to look closely. We noted that, you know, Google had offered all of these, like I just said, and now it's basically Firebase. So for super SDKs, these are primary data hubs that, you know, ultimately can drive connectivity. They supercharge for us platformization, given that the ones that we observe. So in our kind of little tiny sample, we saw Facebook, Firebase, and then Android, which makes sense because we can only look at Android APKs. But maybe Koenig will help us like look at Apple in the future with his GitHub code that I'm sort of trying to play around with right now. And then they kind of compare to other technical objects in the mobile ecosystem. SDKs they're not acted upon. So ultimately, you know, for us, the most important thing for these is that they occupy prominent roles in the entire taxonomy. They are offering major services in regard to programmatic ad tech, major services in terms of development, and then also some of the kind of extensions that users, mostly through social logins. So here's just kind of a little, just to kind of illuminate it a little bit. So this is ASOS. We looked at ASOS because for whatever reason, all of our students really like looking, whenever we told them to look at an app, they always came back to ASOS. Like there's lots of shoppers in the group. It has 18 SDKs, which is the average number of SDKs, and it just kind of worked quite well. So we looked at this one. And I'm just going to kind of focus up here on Firebase. You can both Firebase and Facebook, you can see occupy from all three of the different parts of the taxonomy. I'm sorry, it's always like very overwhelming, these terrible visualizations, but we'll just kind of we'll try to look a little bit more closely. So app development. Inside. So these are all of the different app development services that Firebase offers. They all have privacy agreements. So I looked at all of the different privacy agreements of all of these different things. And then they tell you what data that they can access. So I tried to kind of map what's taking what. So in the ASOS app, because they're using the real-time databases, they're gathering IP addresses, which according to the ICO is considered to be sensitive data that shouldn't be passed, although it seems like they're offering it everywhere. They're getting access to these Firebase installation IDs, Crashlytics installation ID, installation UUIDs, crash traces. And even though it's kind of like obscure data, there are actually there is some literature in computer science that says that actually we can use this data to start to open things up as well. So in our paper, we kind of cite some of that research that kind of points to possibilities of opening things up. So in that sense, we kind of conclude that maybe we should spend a little bit more time thinking about these development services as kind of open, like as kind of like potential privacy harms for end users, if we can move to a kind of more network analysis to map this. But in any case, we can see just from the agreements that data can be accessed, and there is research that says that we can do something with this data. In terms of the programmatic ad tech, they're using services from engagement, attribution, and advertising. So here we can see a little bit more closely. So yeah, ASOS is using stuff for profile building, stuff for cloud messaging, stuff for analytic tracking, stuff for dynamic links, for attribution. They're again using some more analytics. Originally, we had analytics as its own category, but it was so encompassing. It's like everything is an analytic. It seemed like that wasn't a very helpful way to break things down. And then for advertising, they've got kind of integration for their reporting so they can kind of map what's happening. Okay, so, overall, what does it mean to interact with Google services? And this is just a kind of summary from their own privacy agreement. They say that Google collects all of the services. So they collect information from your apps, your browsers and devices, your activity, your location information. So what does it then mean? I kind of pose to you, and this is kind of where we kind of came to, what does it mean if it's collecting all of these things and they have all of these different access points, and Google is inside 90% of the apps that are sitting inside of my phone? What is the kind of landscape that a platform like this can access, and how, and what is the kind of, knowledge that SDK, that kind of keyhole that Mark showed, kind of allow us to understand about kind of platform power and kind of the distribution and ways in which that personal data is being accessed. And I think that's a good place to end, just on time. I forgot people are there.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. We have time for questions.
Really nice talk, both. So who do you see as potential sort of clients, users of your taxonomy, and how would they use it in addition to, I guess, researchers and yourselves? Like, is it something that people can use to, I don't know, somehow make something better in the app development or something?
Do you want to answer?
Well, I mean, for starters, we're working with some people that at Refrain, at Bristol, working on a PETS paper right now, where we're going to use the test bed from within Refrain, and we're hopefully going to scale up to upwards of 1 million apps. We don't know. We're still
like a big number.
we're early, but I mean, we've got till once the test bed. It's February, something like that. So in any case, we want to just actually quantify and take a look at the actual prominence of Google in particular. We feel that it can be used by anybody here that's interested in looking at the mobile ecosystem, looking at apps. We see it as very much a living taxonomy. So going forward and thinking about the shift to the degree to which intelligent agents will become a kind of a new interface, assuming that that's still going to largely, for the time being, exist primarily within the mobile ecosystem again, and thinking the degree to which it would need to change or is useful in looking at that. It's really helpful, we think, for people in humanities and social science that are interested in the relationship between the human and technology in relation to privacy, anybody that's interested in security. So we like to think that it's useful for anybody that wants to try to drill down and think about the ways in which personal data is captured in an app and getting a more granulated understanding of those data flows. And ideally, being able to use that to link to the myriad different kinds of areas of usage so that we can have a clear understanding.
Mhm.
So I kind of have two questions. I think you mentioned that you're currently not looking at iOS or anything part of the Apple platform. Is that correct? Or?
Well, it's more just access issues. Apple is always just such a tricky platform to, I don't know if anyone here works with Apple with great success. But it's like most of the tools that are available, and just APK files in general are easily available. That's mainly why we've worked predominantly with Android. Like Koenig is the only person I can think of who's like published and worked with Apple, and he's worked out code to kind of go in and at least access Apple's files, like app files, and he's put that on his GitHub account. So I think that will come, but you're always kind of, you're like, as a scholar, when you're doing this, you're always kind of in this like slightly, adversarial position, because Apple doesn't really want you. It's not designed for you to kind of go in there and look at their stuff.
But if you can help us do that, then we'd love to work with you.
I mean, if anyone has stories of working I would love to hear them.
Partially about path of least resistance as well, and what's actually useful.
It's why most of the research is done on Android applications, because I mean, like we use APK Pure as like a big giant database to kind of access pretty much any APK that you want. Whereas Apple, there's no database. You have to use this weird code to kind of pull everything to just get one. Yeah.
Well, now I have three questions. The second question, I mean, is really, this is focused on mobile, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with increasing amplification of the desktop environment, right? I mean, now if you're using again a Mac, right? You don't use anything, right? You can use apps, right? And those apps are more or less mirrored, right, on your phone.
Correct.
Using an iPhone, right?
Correct.
So, are there any plans to look at that side?
I mean, I think for us right now is kind of trying to focus. I mean, I think that's kind of part of the same equation. Desktop, like in and of itself, is a bit different. The apps on the desktop, they're very similar to the ones on your phone. So in that sense, I think we're already looking at those. But Mark has done work with his project on voice assistants, looking at skills, which are a little bit the kind of the Amazon equivalent of applications, so extending it from that perspective.
We have a question from online. All right, so Melton, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, really interesting talk. I really enjoyed both the presentations. My main question is, so you guys mentioned this idea of super SDKs, and they track a lot of data, and they capture a lot of data, and they're being used on websites such as like ASOS when you're just trying to shop, where you wouldn't really expect this type of data to be collected. I can see why, as a company, you want to learn more about like your target market, how to increase sales, how to sell more to them. My question would be, I guess, what's the way forward from here, right? Like, is it, at the end of the day, money will always talk for these companies. Do you think it's investigating maybe like privacy enhancing technologies, or is it getting the same functionality but a different route that protects user data? I just wanted your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think my initial like kind of low-hanging fruit, I think easier thing to kind of accomplish from this is that you can see that there's, if there's like 18 different SDKs that are inside the average application, actually from GDPR perspective, you're supposed to have these companies named in your privacy agreement, and most of them do not. So I'm actually doing like a small project right now. We're looking at femtech applications, and we're kind of going through the privacy policies, and we're looking at the SDKs that are inside the app, and we're kind of trying to just map like very kind of simple research of like, are they there? And Koenig has also done this looking with their database, and he hasn't looked for SDKs in particular, but he said actually there's just not a lot of matching in terms of what the app is supposed to be doing, what's there, and what's actually written. So I think like just on a basic level, there should be at least some naming of who these companies are and what are they accessing, because for the most part, like in privacy policies, you get one sentence: this app may share data with third parties. And then maybe they kind of list it has analytics or maybe location, but that's not very specific. And then also in terms of being able to kind of switch and turn off this data, there's another, I think, quite simple way for regulators to kind of come in, because if you look at, and if you kind of look at the privacy policy, it's actually very difficult to extract yourself from any of these processes, yet the law says actually you should be able to do this. So I think just trying to kind of catch up, it's like, if this is what the legislation says that we're entitled to and is supposed to be blocking, and then we know what is actually happening inside these apps and what data these companies are accessing, then how do we bring this into closer alignment? And that's kind of also why we wanted to make the taxonomy, because I think for regulators, this is such a kind of complicated, it's deliberately opaque. So, and it's kind of a bit like, it kind of hurts your brain a little bit. It's like, okay, 18 SDKs, like 90% of apps, like all of like, how do you fully kind of, you know, maybe and it's all very modular. So some use this service, some use that. So how do you kind of stay on top of everything? So at least if there's a kind of way to kind of visualize a little bit about what's going on, I think that will kind of, you know, make it easier for regulators to kind of be able to have a little bit more assurity when they're starting to make decisions around how to kind of, or at least bring SDKs into this conversation. And I think, you know, that's not like a big goal, but at least I think as a first step, like how do we kind of bring this infrastructure into the conversation, because it's currently missing.
Yeah, and just really quickly, if I could add to that, I think just earlier today on the train on the way up from London, you were talking about the difference between kind of this sort of basic concept of transparency as opposed to observability. So in part, we would like to bring about greater observability so that there can be the potential, at least, for more data agency for people in general, so that we can have an idea. As we see increasingly our lives and lived environment are capturable and being captured, and as we see we're moving in this kind of realm, this behemoth just coming over the horizon around kind of generative AI, that there's real dangers in terms of a lack of, like, we can be lulled. Humans tend to embrace any tool that extends their ability to act. That's kind of what we've always done and is a real defining feature of what we are. That is so embedded into a personal data for service kind of transactional model that we can't really gain a full understanding of who is actually able to know what about us and make things actionable in ways that are happening in these kind of opaque spaces. So there's that observability, and definitely we're very interested in working toward the development of pets in relation to the taxonomy. So kind of a both and, I would say.
So unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much again for the last comments. We have to everyone, Mark, you are on today for something, right? And there's also cake, so feel free to
Yay.
thank you.